History usually begins with fanfare, flags rippling in the wind, and speeches that promise eternity. It advances like a confident army, trampling over the rubble of the present in the name of a glorious future. But this is not a story about those who paraded atop tanks, nor about those who signed treaties to thunderous applause. This is a story about courage, a rarer, more costly, and lonelier kind of courage. The courage to fight knowing that victory may never come. The courage to uphold ideas when the entire world begins to call them mistakes. Because there exists a heroism that does not live in monuments, but in persistence. A heroism that does not end in triumph, but in marking. People marked forever by the so-called wrong side of history, not because they were small, but because they confronted forces too vast to be defeated by reason, talent, or truth alone. In the beginning, there is always a flame, a promise, a moment when everything seems possible. In the 20th century, few flames burned as intensely as that of the Russian Revolution, and few men embodied that intellectual and political combustion like Leon Trotsky, a brilliant intellectual, military strategist, magnetic orator. He seemed destined to be one of the permanent architects of the new world rising from the ruins of Tsarism. But history, that merciless entity, is not satisfied with brilliance. As Isaac Deutscher's monumental trilogy demonstrates, Trotsky was defeated not through lack of ideas, but by the emergence of something colder, more silent, and infinitely more resilient: bureaucracy. While he wrote, argued, and envisioned the future, his adversaries learned to master the present, occupying positions, controlling flows, molding institutions. Trotsky's defeat was not merely political, it was symbolic. It was brutal proof that in the historical arena, genius can be crushed by the machinery, and that reason alone cannot stop a machine once it has decided to advance. Exiled, persecuted, erased from official photographs, Trotsky transformed into an uncomfortable ghost, a living reminder that another revolution was possible, and precisely for that reason, needed to be silenced. His death, far from ending the dispute, sealed a bitter lesson. History does not eliminate only bodies, it eliminates alternatives. Each successful ideological defeat reduces the horizon of what can be imagined. The wrong side begins there, at the moment when an idea ceases to be debated and comes to be treated as heresy. But if Trotsky represents the illustrious defeated, the 20th century was merciless in producing anonymous defeated ones, millions of them, men and women who did not write treatises, did not lead armies, did not deliver speeches in public squares, but who believed. They believed with the intensity of those who build their very identity around a historical promise. In second-hand time, Svetlana Alexievich descends from the pinnacles of power and enters the kitchens, the communal dormitories, the corridors of factories and hospitals. What she finds is not cynicism, but faith, a faith that survived queues, deprivations, and sacrifices because it was anchored in the idea of meaning. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it was not merely a state that crumbled, an entire moral universe collapsed. From one day to the next, these people awoke in a world that told them, without ceremony, that their lives had been a historical mistake. The defeat, in this case, had neither the spectacle of a crew nor the thunder of war. It came as an embarrassed silence, as an absence of recognition. People who had lived on the right side for decades were shoved to the wrong side without the right to defend themselves. The heroism here lies not in the non-existent victory, but in the intimate resistance, in the attempt to continue living when one's own past becomes a burden. These are defeats that do not appear in textbooks, but that shape entire generations, laden with nostalgia, resentment, and a question that never finds an answer. What was it all for? It is at this point that history, as official narrative, reveals its cruelest bias. The philosopher Walter Benjamin warned in his theses on the philosophy of history that empathy almost always walks alongside the victor. What we call progress is usually told as a logical, almost natural sequence, erasing the human cost it demanded. Each cultural monument, each celebrated conquest, carries within it the traces of those who were run over along the way. Benjamin invites us to look back not as tourists of the past, but as potential accomplices, capable of recognizing that barbarianism is not a deviation from history. It is frequently the method. But how is this wrong side constructed in practice? How does a society decide that certain ideas, identities, or ways of life must be pushed to the margins? Here, Michel Foucault's thinking illuminates the shadowy terrain where power and normalcy meet. In Discipline and Punish and in The Microphysics of Power, he shows that ideological defeat rarely happens solely on the plane of ideas. It is produced by institutions, by routines, by scientific and administrative discourses that classify, correct, and exclude. Prisons, schools, hospitals, barracks all function as factories of conformity. Those who escape the norm are not merely dissenting, they are maladjusted, dangerous, sick. Thus, the wrong side ceases to be a political position and becomes an almost naturalized condition, something that needs to be treated, contained, or erased. This logic was not restricted to Europe or the great powers. During the Cold War, the global chessboard was redrawn countless times, and many defeats were carefully planned behind the scenes. Documents now preserved by the National Security Archive reveal how entire political projects in the so-called Third World were sabotaged, isolated, or destroyed, not through inevitable internal failures, but through systematic interventions. Leaders who dared to forge autonomous paths were labeled, delegitimized, and, in many cases, eliminated. When these projects crumbled, the dominant narrative did not speak of sabotage, but of incompetence. Once again, defeat was rewritten as proof that such a path should never have been attempted. Even more profound is the defeat of those who never even had the chance to contest the narrative. Indigenous peoples of South America, whose languages, cosmologies, and knowledge systems were crushed by the process of nation-building, represent perhaps the most radical example of a wrong side imposed by force. The Kurt Nimuendaju Digital Library preserves precious vestiges of these worldviews, not as exotic relics, but as evidence that other forms of organizing life were, and still are, possible. Here, heroism does not lie in battles won, but in cultural survival, in the transmission of knowledge, despite centuries of attempted erasure. In traversing these stories, a pattern emerges with uncomfortable clarity. The wrong side of history is rarely wrong in essence. It is, most often, the side that lost the capacity to impose its version of events. Political defeat transforms into moral defeat, then into historical defeat, until silence seems to confirm the victor's narrative. But this silence is deceptive. It is full of muffled voices, interrupted projects, futures that never came to exist. And perhaps therein lies the true epic tone of this story, not in triumph, but in the persistence of memory. Remembering the defeated is not an exercise in nostalgia or resentment. It is an act of intellectual courage. It is refusing the idea that history is an infallible tribunal. It is recognizing that pride and heroism also belong to those who dared to challenge the dominant course, even knowing they could be crushed by it. Because in the end, the wrong side of history may simply be the place where all the possibilities the world has not yet had the courage to realize are concentrated.